Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere different. So if you've had a long day, go ahead and dim the lights, get under a blanket, and let your brain slow down. Don't worry, nothing here will keep you awake with excitement. You're safe. Tonight is all about drifting through the quiet corridors of history, where nothing explodes, but everything is a little absurd. We're talking about Imperial China, where emperors lived in palaces the size of cities, but still managed to be profoundly miserable. The food was extravagant, the servants endless, the clothes embroidered with literal dragon scales. And yet their daily routines were so strict, and their personal lives so ridiculous, that if you or I somehow woke up in the Forbidden City tomorrow morning, we'd probably last, at best, about 12 hours. Maybe 6 if you count the breakfast etiquette. So, tuck in. Tonight we'll stroll through the quiet absurdities of Chinese imperial life, peek at the dynasties that produced emperors more sheltered than houseplants, and gently laugh at the idea that absolute power made their lives even remotely enjoyable. Spoiler: it didn't. Let's start with the basics. Imagine waking up as the Emperor of China. Sounds impressive, right? But here's the problem. You don't actually get to decide when to wake up. No sleeping in. The court eunuchs decide for you. At dawn, they're already knocking, or more accurately, bowing in the outer chamber. You're dragged out of bed before the sun has properly stretched. Breakfast? Forget pancakes. Forget coffee. Instead, you're given a table with dozens of dishes, each prepared according to strict rules. Sounds nice, until you realize you're not actually allowed to eat most of it. That's because the food is partly ceremonial. It's there to look imperial. Imagine sitting at a buffet and being told, "Please admire the dumplings, but only nibble at this one bowl of porridge." That's the start of your day, and don't even think about deciding you want bacon. No. The palace kitchen isn't about satisfying your cravings. It's about balancing yin and yang in your diet, warding off bad humors, and following ancient manuals on what the Son of Heaven should chew on in spring versus autumn. Congratulations, your stomach is now state business. After breakfast, the fun really begins. Court meetings. Now, you might picture a council of wise advisors, maybe lively debates, like in a movie. In reality, it was hours of kneeling bureaucrats reading memorized reports in a monotone. Taxes from this province, flood in that river valley, another petition about corruption in a county you've never visited. And you can't yawn. Because remember, you're the Son of Heaven. You're supposed to look divine, even if you're 14 years old, half asleep, and your tutor has been yelling at you about Confucian classics since dawn. One misplaced expression, one twitch of boredom, and suddenly rumors spread that the emperor disrespects the mandate of heaven, which is basically ancient HR language for, maybe we should replace him. So, yes, by 9 a.m., you're already trapped in endless paperwork, except you're not allowed to actually touch the paperwork. That's done by scribes. You just nod. Which sounds easy, until you remember you've got to nod convincingly for hours without slumping sideways. Now let's float over to the palace itself. Specifically, the Forbidden City in Beijing, which, despite the name, was less like a single palace and more like a walled world. Picture nearly 10,000 rooms, stretching over 180 acres. Impressive, but also claustrophobic. Because as emperor, you don't just stroll outside for a walk. Oh no. The world beyond the walls? Off limits, unless arranged with full ceremony. Imagine being the absolute ruler of a civilization with millions of subjects, and you're not allowed to walk down the street for a snack. Everything you see has been polished, curated, rehearsed. Courtyards swept daily, paint touched up. Trees trimmed into shapes that say, "We control nature," and the people you see. Also carefully arranged. Servants, eunuchs, concubines, all of them trained to never act natural around you. If anyone in your line of sight makes a funny face or sneezes without bowing afterward, that's their last day on the job, which means your entire existence is like living inside a stage play 24/7. You are the star, but also the prisoner of a never-ending performance. Speaking of eunuchs, let's pause there. The imperial household had thousands of them. Thousands. Entire departments run by castrated men whose lives revolved around the emperor's laundry, food, and ceremonial slippers. Imagine trying to complain about your day while 70 eunuchs stand silently in the room, making notes on how convincingly you complained. And yes, palace eunuchs got powerful because they controlled access. Want to see the emperor? You go through the eunuchs. Want your petition to be read at all? Convince the eunuchs, which meant emperors often ended up under the thumb of their servants. In theory, you're the most powerful human alive. In practice, your head eunuch is deciding which memos land on your desk. It's like being the CEO of a company where your personal assistant actually runs the entire board. You sign what they hand you. You eat what they approve. You go where they permit. Absolute power on paper. Now let's talk about the concubines. Yes, emperors had hundreds, sometimes thousands, which sounds like every teenage boy's dream until you realize the logistics. The emperor doesn't get to casually pick a date. No, there's a system, a schedule, an actual roster, rotated with bureaucratic precision. Each night, selected concubines were bathed, perfumed, and rolled, literally rolled, on a small wheeled platform into the emperor's chamber. This was supposed to reduce favoritism, though of course favoritism happened anyway. But imagine, you're supposed to be divine, but your love life is managed like an Excel spreadsheet. Also, the women? They weren't exactly there by choice. Many were selected from noble families, or even forced from common ones, to serve the dynasty, which made palace romance less candlelit passion and more administrative duty. And if you actually liked one, too bad. Spend too much time with her, and suddenly you're accused of neglecting the others, or worse, letting her family influence politics. Congratulations. Even your bedroom is a minefield of statecraft. We also can't forget about the mandate of heaven. This was the cosmic justification for emperors existing at all. Rule well, and heaven approves. Rule badly. Famines, rebellions, floods. And clearly, heaven has withdrawn its mandate. Which meant every time there was a natural disaster, guess who people blamed? Yep, you. Imagine a bad storm destroys crops. It's not weather happens. It's the emperor angered the cosmos. And no one wants to be the teenager accused of upsetting heaven because a river overflowed. That was the level of pressure. You're barely old enough to shave. But if locusts appear in Shandong, suddenly everyone's whispering that you've lost divine favor. Sleep well. Daily life in the palace was also endlessly ritualized. Want to eat lunch? There's a prescribed order. Want to pray? There's an exact bow angle. Even walking was ceremonial. The emperor couldn't just wander around. He had to move in a way that reflected cosmic harmony. Imagine being told your stride must symbolize balance between yin and yang. Now try doing that in silk shoes on polished marble. One slip, and your divine aura is ruined. And yet, beneath all this theater, The emperors themselves were human, which means they cracked under the pressure. Many retreated into hobbies, some painted, some obsessed over poetry, others ignored governance completely, letting eunuchs and courtiers rule while they drank or built elaborate gardens. One emperor became so obsessed with carpentry that he left politics to rot while he personally hammered wood. The Son of Heaven, playing with nails. So why wouldn't you last a day in Imperial China? Because everything, from your breakfast to your bedtime, was dictated by rules so suffocating that even absolute monarchs suffocated under them. You'd wake up too early, eat food you don't want, sit through endless reports, get bossed around by eunuchs, avoid accidentally sneezing during rituals, and maybe, just maybe, end the day with a concubine chosen by committee. And if you dared to complain, well, heaven itself would be disappointed. All right, let's drift a little further, because Imperial China wasn't just about emperors. It was about dynasties stacked on dynasties, each one convinced they were the pinnacle of civilization, right up until famine, corruption, or invading nomads proved otherwise. And the emperors, poor things, usually had front-row seats to their own dynasty's decline. But let's save that thread and keep floating through the lives of emperors who had everything, and somehow absolutely nothing. So, we've set the stage. You're the emperor. You're trapped in a palace the size of a city, surrounded by eunuchs who decide whether or not you get dessert. Life isn't exactly absolute freedom. It's more like being the lead actor in a play you didn't audition for, with 10,000 stagehands watching your every move. But what if you decide you don't actually feel like ruling? What if you're, say, the Ming Dynasty's Wanli emperor, who one day simply stopped showing up to work? The Wanli emperor began his reign in the late 1500s with the usual expectations: balance heaven and earth, oversee officials, manage floods, be divine, etc. At first he tried. He sat through meetings. He read reports. He nodded at bureaucrats until his neck got sore. And then he just quit. Not officially. He didn't abdicate. He just stopped going to court for decades. Imagine a boss who just never comes in, but also refuses to let anyone else take over. That was Wanli. He retreated into his private palace chambers, surrounded himself with luxuries, and spent his days sulking over one problem. The court refused to let him name his favorite son as heir. Wanli wanted his concubine's child to inherit. Officials said no, it had to be the empress's son. It turned into a decades-long passive-aggressive standoff. So the Emperor of China, ruler of millions, just sat in his room and refused to sign documents. He let petitions pile up. Wars were happening on the borders. Famines devastated provinces. And Wanli was like, nope, not until you agree with me. Bureaucrats kept sending memos. He ignored them. For 30 years. Imagine if your boss ignored emails for 3 days. It'd be chaos. Now scale that to an empire and stretch it to 30 years. That was Ming China under Wanli. Of course, the bureaucracy kept running, because that's what bureaucracies do. Eunuchs stepped in, officials argued with each other, provinces improvised. But the fact remained, the emperor had essentially gone on strike, and he didn't care that the dynasty was sliding toward collapse. He just wanted his favorite son on the throne. It's the ultimate fine, let it all burn move. Except when an emperor does it, millions of people suffer. But hey, at least Wanli proved one thing. You can be the most powerful man alive and still be the world's most stubborn teenager in disguise. Let's float over to another Ming gem, the Jiajing Emperor. His life is the opposite of Wan Li's laziness. It's what happens when you actually try too hard. Jiajing became emperor in 1521, but he wasn't the son of the previous emperor. He was a cousin, which meant the court expected him to honor his predecessor's father as if it were his own. Jiajing did not like this. He wanted to honor his actual father. So he launched a years-long political campaign with endless arguments, punishments, and even executions, all so he could say morning prayers to the dad he actually liked. That's imperial privilege in a nutshell, turning filial piety into a national crisis. But his real legacy, obsession with Taoist immortality potions. Jiajing was convinced that by consuming special elixirs, he could extend his life indefinitely. Spoiler: most of these potions were loaded with mercury and lead and arsenic. You know, all the fun stuff. So while peasants starved, Jiajing spent fortunes on alchemists brewing longevity elixirs that slowly poisoned him. He lived in semi-seclusion, drinking toxic sludge, convinced he'd live forever. Instead, he died at 59, basically from long-term chemical self-sabotage. Oh, and he was almost killed earlier by his own palace maids. They got sick of his abuse, so they tried to strangle him in bed with a silk scarf. It failed, because of course it did. But imagine your staff deciding, you know what? Let's murder the boss tonight. That says a lot about workplace morale in the Forbidden City. By now you might be thinking, wow, Chinese emperors sound a little eccentric. And yes, they were. But also, can we blame them? From childhood, they were raised in suffocating bubbles. Their tutors beat Confucian texts into them. Every snack was monitored, every word memorized. The outside world? A rumor. So when they finally got the throne, many cracked. Some sulked. Some poisoned themselves. Some refused to leave bed. It was like handing the universe's biggest job to someone who'd only been trained to recite poetry and never touch grass. Now let's drift forward into the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, run by the Manchus. These guys were outsiders who conquered China in the 1600s and then kept the whole giant machine running for about 300 years. And while some Qing emperors were competent, others were textbook cases of being crushed by the job. Take the Xianfeng emperor in the mid-1800s. His reign coincided with one of the worst moments in Chinese history, the Taiping Rebellion, when a self-proclaimed brother of Jesus Christ led a massive civil war that killed, conservatively, 20 million people. So what did Xianfeng do during the deadliest rebellion in human history? He panicked, packed his bags, and ran away. Literally fled Beijing with the court, abandoning the capital, while foreign armies looted the summer palace. He retreated to the mountains, drank heavily, and died at 30. Absolute ruler, son of heaven, who tapped out when things got tough. To be fair, I might also collapse under the pressure of a 20 million death rebellion. But still, not a great look for a divine emperor. Of course, when the emperor dies young, someone has to pick up the slack. Enter the legendary Empress Dowager Cixi. She wasn't supposed to be in charge. She started as a concubine, caught the emperor's eye, gave birth to a son, and after Xianfeng's death, positioned herself as regent. And once she got power, she never let go. For nearly 50 years, she ruled from behind the curtain, literally. Court officials would speak to an empty throne, and she'd be sitting behind a screen, listening, deciding everything. The emperor, whoever he was at the time, was a figurehead. Cixi pulled the strings. She's one of the most famous power brokers in Chinese history. And while people argue whether she saved or ruined the Qing, The fact remains, the so-called divine emperors were reduced to background props in their own dynasty. A reminder that the Forbidden City often functioned less like a throne room and more like a very expensive puppet theater. And speaking of expensive, let's not forget how the palace burned through money. Take the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace. It was a sprawling complex of gardens, lakes, and palaces built as the emperor's personal retreat. Imagine Versailles, but bigger, with Chinese flair and imported European fountains. It was so lavish that when Anglo-French troops looted and burned it in 1860, people described it as one of the worst cultural crimes of the century. Priceless treasures gone. And the emperor? Xianfeng was hiding in the mountains, drinking himself to death. Once again, absolute ruler, zero actual control. But maybe the saddest emperor of all was the last emperor, Puyi. Born in 1906, he became emperor as a toddler, carried onto the throne at age 2 while he screamed for his mother. He was given candy to shut him up while being proclaimed Son of Heaven. Imagine being told at age 2, "Congratulations, you're divine." Also, you're not allowed to leave the palace, ever. Puyi grew up in a gilded cage, waited on by thousands, but utterly alone. He had no friends. His toys were chosen for him. His food was tested by eunuchs. By his teens, he was chain-smoking in silk robes, watching the dynasty crumble. And crumble it did. By 1912, the Qing fell, and Puyi technically abdicated. But he was still allowed to live in the Forbidden City, like a ghost of an empire, with servants bowing to him as if he still ruled. He spent his days bored out of his mind, playing with Western gadgets, wearing British suits, while the world outside modernized. Eventually, even that ended. He was expelled from the palace, became a puppet ruler under the Japanese, and finally ended up working as a humble gardener in communist China. From Son of Heaven to pulling weeds, it's almost poetic. So when we say you wouldn't last a day in imperial China, it's not because of starvation or danger. It's because the entire system was designed to suffocate the human out of the human. You'd be expected to sit still, follow ritual, ignore your instincts, and embody cosmic balance while the world fell apart around you. You'd spend your youth memorizing Confucius, your adulthood fighting passive-aggressive bureaucrats, and your twilight years wondering if the eunuchs were plotting against you. And if you cracked under the pressure, don't worry, you'd be in good company. Most emperors did. All right, let's keep floating. We've lingered in China's palaces long enough. For the next stretch, we'll drift westward, toward Europe, where emperors and kings weren't much better. Different crowns, same dysfunctions, spoiled princes, inbred monarchs, royal meltdowns. But that's for the next part. For now, let's let the Forbidden City fade behind us. The echo of drums, the scent of incense, and the sight of a very tired emperor, wondering if today will finally be the day he actually does his job. So, we're floating away from the red walls of the Forbidden City now. The echo of drums and ceremonial bows is fading behind us, and as the mist clears, we're crossing into Europe. Different continent, different dynasties. But honestly, the same story. People in fancy hats, locked inside golden cages, being just a little too weird for their own good. If Imperial China's problem was suffocation by ritual, Europe's was suffocation by family. Specifically, the fact that they all kept marrying each other. Which leads us to one of history's most notorious dynasties, the Habsburgs. Ah yes, the Habsburgs. Imagine taking the idea of a family business, and stretching it across an entire continent for 500 years. Their motto could have been, "Why outsource power when you can just marry your cousin and call it a treaty?" The Habsburg strategy was simple. Don't fight wars, just arrange marriages. Spain, Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, all brought under one family umbrella by strategically swapping brides and grooms. Efficient? Sure. But the genetic consequences? Let's just say the family tree started to look more like a circle, which brings us to the famous Habsburg jaw, a protruding chin so distinctive that it basically became their logo. Generations of intermarriage made it worse with each emperor. By the time we get to Charles II of Spain in the late 1600s, the poor man could barely chew his food and had the IQ of, well, a man whose parents were uncle and niece, because they literally were. Let's pause there. Charles II, also known as the Bewitched, he became King of Spain at age 3, and immediately the court knew there was a problem. He couldn't walk until he was 8, couldn't talk until he was 4, couldn't eat without help as an adult. But hey, he wore the crown, so technically, he was divine. Doctors tried everything. They even fed him ground-up gold and powdered human skulls, because nothing says royal health care like snorting bone dust. None of it worked. Charles remained frail, sickly, and infertile. Spain collapsed around him, but all the court cared about was, could he produce an heir? Spoiler, he couldn't. His death in 1700 ended the Spanish Habsburg line and triggered a massive war. So, one family's refusal to marry outside the circle literally reshaped European history. And Charles II, he's remembered less for ruling and more for being the genetic cautionary tale of the millennium. But let's not single out the Habsburgs. Dysfunction was everywhere. Take France, for example, a country that gave us not one but multiple monarchs who basically said, running the kingdom? Nah, I'll pass. The most famous, of course, is Louis XIV, the Sun King. On paper, he was magnificent. Built Versailles, strutted around in wigs, called himself the state. In reality, he micromanaged court fashion while letting wars bankrupt the country. He held morning lever ceremonies where nobles watched him get dressed. Literally. Imagine having to applaud your boss for successfully putting on socks. That was Versailles. And of course the courtiers loved it. Because the closer you were to the king's shoehorn, the more political influence you had. The palace became a competitive reality show, except instead of winning roses, you won the chance to hand the king his underwear. But Louis XIV, for all his vanity, at least lived long and ruled effectively enough to keep things together. His great-great-grandson, Louis XVI, was less fortunate. You know, the guy who lost his head in the French Revolution. Louis XVI wasn't stupid. He was just awkward, shy, more interested in locks and carpentry than ruling. He'd spend hours tinkering in his workshop, building little mechanisms, while his kingdom teetered on the edge of financial ruin. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was busy being the tabloid scandal of her day, accused of everything from reckless spending to bizarre sexual rumors. Meanwhile, the people of Paris were starving. Bread prices skyrocketed. Riots broke out. And Louis? He scribbled in his diary, "Nothing happened today." That was his entry on the day the Bastille was stormed. Nothing happened. A prison was attacked, Paris was in chaos, and the king was like, meh, quiet afternoon. Needless to say, things did not end well. Let's float north for a moment, to Russia. Because if you think European monarchs were eccentric, the czars said, "Hold my vodka." Take Peter the Great, famous for modernizing Russia, dragging it into the European mainstream, and building St. Petersburg, but also famous for being about as subtle as a cannon. He personally beheaded rebels with an axe. He forced nobles to shave their beards because he thought they looked too medieval. He even created a beard tax, where men had to carry a little copper token proving they'd paid for the privilege of having facial hair. Imagine TSA, but for your chin. Peter was also obsessed with dentistry. He carried pliers with him and would randomly yank out teeth from anyone, whether they needed it or not. Friends, servants, strangers. If he saw a tooth he didn't like, out it came. He collected them in a jar. Son of heaven? More like nightmare dentist. And yet, despite the horror stories, Peter really did drag Russia into a new era, just at the cost of everyone's dental health. His successors, though, were less inspiring. Fast forward to Nicholas II, the last Tsar. Another awkward man in an impossible role. He loved his family, adored his children, wrote sweet letters to his wife. But as ruler of a crumbling empire, disastrous. Nicholas was indecisive, isolated, and completely under the sway of questionable advisors. Enter Rasputin, the infamous mad monk with hypnotic eyes and a reputation for both healing and scandal. Rasputin gained influence because he seemed to ease the suffering of the Tsar's hemophiliac son, which meant Nicholas and his wife clung to him desperately. To the rest of Russia, it looked like the empire was being run by a creepy mystic who wouldn't die. And indeed, when nobles finally tried to kill Rasputin, it took poison, bullets, and drowning before he actually stayed dead. By then, Nicholas had already lost the trust of his people. The Romanov dynasty collapsed in 1917, ending with the Tsar and his family executed in a basement. Once again, a monarch who might have been a decent middle-class neighbor, Nicholas loved gardening and sailing, was utterly unsuited to running a giant, collapsing empire. Now, let's gently drift to England, where dysfunction took the form of melodrama. Cue Henry VIII. 6 wives, endless scandals, a waistline that expanded with each passing year. Henry is remembered as the man who split from the Catholic Church just to divorce his first wife. But his personal life was even messier. He fell in love like a teenager, obsessed over heirs, and executed wives when he got bored or suspicious. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, heads rolled. By the end, Henry was obese, covered in festering leg ulcers, and so paranoid he trusted almost no one. Absolute ruler, yes, but also a man who could barely walk, carried around on a mechanical chair, raging at servants while eating too much roast beef. Not exactly the glamorous image of divine monarchy. So, whether in China, France, Russia, Spain, or England, the story repeats. Absolute power trapped these rulers in gilded cages. Some sulked, some raged, some poisoned themselves with mercury. But few of them were genuinely happy, and even fewer were genuinely competent. And here's the thing. You and I, we'd collapse instantly. We like to imagine we'd do better, rule wisely, eat the fancy feasts, wear the crowns. But the reality was endless ritual, crushing pressure, scheming courtiers, and the knowledge that the tiniest mistake could spark rebellion.